Good evening, everybody. Fantastic to see this turnout. It's wonderful to see you all here. And it's my great pleasure to introduce our very distinguished speaker, Dr. Lloyd Axeworthy. UBC Okanagan has a special connection with Dr. Axeworthy, who is currently President and Vice Chancellor of the University of Winnipeg. Prior to coming to UBC Okanagan, our Provost, Ala Abdelaziz, who I tried to bring up on stage but he wouldn't come, served as Vice President of Research, International and External Affairs at the University of Winnipeg under Dr. Axeworthy. We stole him away. Lloyd has obviously forgiven us, and he's coming out here as a sign of that. Before taking the helm at the University of Winnipeg, Dr. Axeworthy was Director and CEO of the Liu Institute for Global Issues at UBC, so he has another connection through that as well. He served 6 years in the Manitoba Legislative Assembly and 21 years in the federal parliament. He held several cabinet positions and is best known for his time as Minister of Foreign Affairs. Dr. Axeworthy is a member of the Commission on Legal Empowerment for the Poor. He is a board member of the Canadian Landmine Foundation, the MacArthur Foundation, and Human Rights Watch, where he chairs the advisory board for America's Watch. He is also on the boards for the Lester B. Pearson College, University of the Arctic, the Pacific Council on International Policy, is a member of the Advisory Council of the Ethical Globalization Initiative. Minister Axeworthy is one of the best known and most influential Minister of Foreign Affairs in the past generation. He became internationally known for his advancement of the human security concept, in particular the Ottawa Treaty, a landmark global treaty banning anti-personnel landmines, for which he was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. For his efforts in establishing the International Criminal Court and the Protocol on Child Soldiers, he received the North-South Institute's Peace Award. United Nations Secretary General Kofi Annan appointed Minister Axeworthy as a special envoy for Ethiopia, Eritrea to assist in implementing a peace agreement between the East African countries in 2004. His book, Navigating a New World, Canada's Global Future, maps out a course which we can take as active citizens in the demanding world of the 21st century to make it safer, more sustainable, and more humane. Please welcome Dr. Lloyd Axeworthy.
Well, thank you very much, and good evening, everybody. I hope I'm in the right place. I've been backstage, and several people came in wanting to know if this is the place that Shakespeare in the Round was going to be held. So if any of you think that I'm Hamlet, then you're in the wrong place, and I think you've got to go to the Black Box Theater next door. That's what is known as a public service announcement. I want to thank Doug for his kind and carefully edited introduction. It's always nice to know that your checkered career can be kind of cleanly erased by the stroke of a pen of the Deputy Vice Chancellor, and I thank you for your judgment and discretion on these matters. And I want to thank the folks at the UBC Okanagan for hosting me for the last 24 hours and giving me a chance to see the very dynamic work that's going on, and I know that you in the Valley here are very proud of this institution, which is in such a short time bringing a great acclaim to your community. And I want to say, as somebody who sort of presides over another institution, that it's great to see sort of the emergence of another strong institution of higher learning in this country. And I compliment Doug and Ala and all the members of faculty and deans who are responsible for that. I also want to say that it was nice to come back to the Okanagan Valley. Part of that checkered career I talked about was that for a year or so I spent working up in the Paradise Ranch, just a little bit outside of Penticton, some of you would probably know. And so when I was invited to come, I asked Al to make sure that he would check the police blotters to make sure that my various misdemeanors when I was carousing around your community in ancient times would probably be sort of erased by the statute of limitations. But I found that things have become so much more civilized. They took me on a couple of rounds of your excellent wineries, which may mean that tonight's speech has absolutely no connection to whatever I thought or wrote of what I was going to do, but it's simply part of the source of inspiration that I bring to this. And I thought I might sort of talk a little bit about just in this very historic moment that we've been living in. I suppose there isn't anybody in this room who probably deep in the secret of their hearts wouldn't like to have a chance to sort of sit on the back stoop in a place in Chicago after playing a game of hoopsters with Barack Obama and say, Barack, let me tell you how it is in Canada. And that's why I thought tonight we'd have a conversation. So I'm not here to give a great formal lecture, even if I could. I thought we should just have a conversation about what it might mean with this new beginning, this fresh start, this open door that has all of a sudden emerged into our lives in the past week. And I have to confess to having a certain degree of itching, as Doug probably pointed out. I spent 27 years in the sort of in the political trenches, and there are a few twinges that still take place when you see the kind of excitement and ebullience and energy that has all of a sudden been mobilized in that country and around its political life. However, I have sort of been in another world for a while, as Churchill said when he retired from his politics, that he was looking forward simply to hot baths and cold champagne, new peas and old brandy. I wish I had followed his advice. I instead went to the university, which isn't, while it is the home of quiet contemplation, is not exactly the place that you go for peace and quiet on a daily basis. In fact, when I first went there, I was told by another member of the small club of presidents that I should really think of myself more as a caretaker in a cemetery. And I said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, you'll have lots of people under you, but nobody will listen. So I'm glad very much to see a few here tonight that may be open to a few of my comments and conversations. And I did want to talk about the milestone because probably for all of us as Canadians, the touchstone, very much deeply embedded, I think, as Ike Barber is talking about, is our relationship with our neighbor. We share this great piece of rock and geography called North America. And what has been a preoccupation, a continuous questioning, an enormous debate, a matter of a subject of great discussion is, how do you get along? How does a country of our size and our demeanor and our character live next to this most powerful country in the world? And it's a question, of course, that is particularly relevant with the election of a new president, because he will bring a substantially new agenda. He's going to have his own way of doing things with a very different administration from that of Mr. Bush. And it also puts a special onus on us because, to I think our great delight, one of his first announcements is that he would visit Canada, that we will be his first port of call outside his own country, which puts us in a very sort of strategic, if not almost unique position of being one of the first place that President Obama will begin to demonstrate his commitments and how he's going to deal with the rest of the world. And it's not an easy question. I do recall shortly after I left Foreign Affairs and actually was invited to spend some time at UBC in the Lew Center in Vancouver. I was invited to speak at a gathering in Taiwan. I'd never been able to visit because as a foreign minister you can't go to Taiwan. It's sort of not on your passport. So I was really kind of looking forward to this, and it was I didn't get much sleep in the plane, but that probably didn't make much difference in my general level of coherence. And I think things went pretty well. It had been sort of talking about this till the very end of the talk. This young man out in the back row gets up and he said, so, Dr. Axel, he said, look, we in Taiwan live to this next door to this very big, powerful country. And you were a foreign affairs minister for 5 years, and you had to figure out how to live next door to a powerful country. Do you have any advice for us? Well, in the old days, I would have had a very smart young foreign service officer sort of shifting me a note, a briefing, an outline, usually something like keep it simple, stupid, or something, something elegant of that kind. But I was kind of on my own. There I was. And when on my own, I sort of kind of dig down in my Manitoba roots. And I said, well, there's an old saying that we had in Manitoba, that if you're making love to a porcupine, do it carefully. I have to say it didn't translate into Chinese too well. And I realized that I may have sort of overstepped my diplomatic protocol when the next morning I was invited to one of these power breakfasts. You know, they have in Taipei. They get up at 5 in the morning to kind of get early into the stock market and all this kind of stuff. So I come into the room, and I have to confess, it wasn't exactly what I call a warm and fuzzy feeling in the place. In fact, nobody was looking at me. So I said to my host, I said, look, have I done something wrong here? I mean, he said, well, it probably has something to do with the story in this morning's paper. And I said, well, what does the story say? He said, well, it described your talk last night and how your answer to the question of how do you get along dealing with a big power like China and the United States, it said, well, it's like making love to a concubine. So you can see I come well-versed in all kinds of good advice for those of you. Probably develop a new theory of international relations right on the spot. But one of the first things in that relationship, by the way, as we're talking about the United States, is to realize that President Obama is not going to get up first thing in the morning saying, what are we going to do about Canada? I mean, it's not necessarily topmost mind issues. Again, if I could just tell a little story out of school, when I was in Mr. Chrétien's cabinet as a foreign minister, he was planning a series of speeches, and he said that he would like to get some advice as to how Americans sort of saw Canada, how they saw him as the prime minister. And he said, could you do some soundings? Well, we said, we do a kind of a regular little surveying and throughout our embassies and consulates, and we kind of put that question out there. And when the results came back, I was a little hesitant to share them with the Prime Minister. So I kind of dragged the puck a little bit, and every time we go to cabinet, he said, so Axeworthy, where's the results? Tell me. I mean, I'm getting ready for my speech. I said, well, Prime Minister, we're not quite complete yet. We have to kind of analyze the results. Well, he finally said to me, look, if you don't give me the results soon, this could be very much a career-challenging decision for you to hold back. So I kind of finally fessed up, and I said, well, Prime Minister, if you really want sort of the honest truth answer, the best-known Canadian in the United States is Pamela Lee Anderson. And the Prime Minister says to me, well, why is that? And I said, well, they see more of her than they see of you. So I'm not sure it exactly explains in a great, profound depth what the dynamics of our relationship are, except what I can tell you, and what I would like to share with you as part of our conversation, is how dramatically it is changing, almost by day. And that we are now living in a world of so much uncertainty that to be able to plot a course, to navigate, to use the title I used in the book, is not like having a GPS in your car where you can pinpoint the exact address in the street. It's more like some of you who are sailors out on the lake who do dead reckoning. You kind of have a sense of where you're going to go, but there's no particular major markers or lighthouses or guideposts. You have to have a sense of how to get there. Because the landscape, the seascape, is going through such a major transformation. And that how we connect ourselves with the United States and its new president has a lot to do with the kind of world that we want to live in and how it is going through its own quite fundamental, almost major earthquake-style shifts of the earth plates. First are the issues themselves. There's one thing I learned, I guess, in my years in government, certainly as foreign affairs, and that I've since discovered almost daily in my present occupation, and just as a citizen who reads the paper, watches the news, is the kind of issues that we now deal with cannot be confined inside one set of borders. It can't be managed by one set of countries. That the kind of things that we face, perhaps most indicative, as we've seen in the last several months in terms of the collapse of the global financial markets and the impact it's having, that nobody is immune. Nobody can hide. Nobody's an island. There's nowhere that you can say that somehow we can put a bubble around us or a cocoon. And it is reflective of a much broader set of patterns, that the way in which the world has become so connected and linked, that the way that we govern ourselves according to our municipalities and our provinces and even our nation states is increasingly becoming a little bit obsolescent when you consider that the scope and nature and depth and breadth of the issues transcend the boundaries, cover all people. That there is no way that you can sort of say that as the environment is shifting so dramatically as a result of the changing sort of warmth in the atmosphere, that that's something that any one of us in any one jurisdiction can manage or control. We all have to do our part. And by the way, that was very clearly the message that President Obama gave in his inauguration. It was the first time in a long time I've heard an American president say, I need your help. I can't do this alone. It's quite a contrast to the Bush administration's view is that they could do it alone, that they were the mighty empire, that they didn't have to listen to anybody else. They had all the power, all the might, and that, thank you very much, we don't really need to allies, and even the closest allies who live next door were not given much of a hearing. So Obama brings in, I think, that understanding, that fundamental understanding, that whether it's a threat of climate change, global pandemics of diseases that can be transferred on the sole of your shoe as you sort of walk in the jungle and come back to live in Canada, and all of a sudden a virus spreads. Whether it's a world food crisis that is now sort of substantially draining the capacity of this world to grow enough food for the population. There's almost an inverse relationship by the growth in population and the increasing suffocation of food supplies, because even with all our great technological innovations, we're simply losing ground. That we are now sort of completely sort of hemmed in so many ways by growing global networks of international crime. I mean, I'm not here to kind of make you feel bad or anything. This is kind of a Thursday night and weekend's coming up, but, let me tell you, one of the things that disturbed me mightily, about 3 years ago, I was asked to go to Colombia on behalf of Human Rights Watch. We were working on a program to try to negotiate the release of a number of young children who had been sort of captured by the drug lords in Colombia. And as you got into it and began negotiating with them, you realized that the drug lords in Colombia are the same people who are delivering hard drugs in East Vancouver. That we're not immune from it. It's exactly the same issue, and that they encompass a network of money, people, airplanes, resources, communications that far surpass that of probably about 2/3 of the nations in the world. And that's what we live with. I mean, that's who we are. It's not anything to kind of get into a catatonic state about. It's just the new reality. And that's why one of the most important sort of and critical responses is how do we begin to slowly, carefully, thoughtfully, begin to build the ways to put those forces under some kind of governance so that we can actually manage them, that they don't get out of control, that they don't overwhelm, and we just don't let things happen to us as if it was sort of dropping from the sky like Chicken Little. And ladies and gentlemen, that's, to me, is the thing that I suppose if there's itches away at me and aches at me, is that in the last 8 years, we have regressed in that issue. Because the leadership of the United States, which has been so crucial through so many decades, took a position that they were not going to try to build a new architecture, that they were not going to collaborate and cooperate, that they were sort of going to make decisions according to what they thought solely was the best for themselves, and if everybody else wanted to come along, you could. If you didn't, too bad. And as a result, we went through some very difficult times where there was a real disdain, a negligence for building and creating collaboration and cooperation. Let me just give you one very specific example, which is so fresh in my mind. I mean, President Bush just left on the helicopter 2 days ago. 3 days before he left, in the very swan dying days of his administration, he issues a directive that says that the United States will unilaterally declare that in the circumpolar Arctic region, that they have the right to establish the right of passage, regardless of the laws of Canada. The Prime Minister Harper has made quite a strong effort to say, there are ways that we have to establish some laws and rules in this area. Well, Mr. Bush said, I don't care, doesn't matter to me. I'm simply going to push my way through. And I'm not going to use the Arctic Council, which is something that I was able to establish when I was in Foreign Affairs, which for the first time brought together northern people and northern countries to talk about environment, to talk about trade, to talk about resources. And so this was just sort of pushed aside as a meaningless, irrelevant exercise, even though over the last decade, lots of people have said, if we don't get our act together and work together, then the potential of a new international trade route that will connect East and West, Europe to Asia, with North America in the center, which, by the way, properly done, can be an enormous stimulus for economic growth. It will shorten trade patterns around the world by 10 or 20%. It's the kind of boost that we need to be able to say, look at now we can bring goods in cheaper. It's an enormous sort of catalyst for new trade. But we have to play by some rules. We simply can't let everybody do their own thing. So 3 days before he goes, Mr. Bush says, we're going to do our own thing. And that, to me, was symptomatic, symbolic maybe, of the difficulty we have had as a close neighbor in the past 8 years trying to find what are the mechanisms, what are the ways in which we work. We have some 270 treaties with the United States, going back over 100 years, that cover a wide variety of issues: environment, water, resources, trade, immigration, security. Most of those treaties have now been basically shelved because our partner doesn't want to obey treaties. The basic thesis was treaties circumspect, limit our capacity as a nation to do what we think we should do. I don't have to tell people in British Columbia about the kind of impacts, because you live in the prime lumber region of North America, and you know what's happened on our trade rules, that every time there was a legitimate decision by a tribunal under NAFTA, some Georgia lobbyist would go to Washington and grab a senator, and they would talk to the president and say, we don't have to obey that rule. We don't have to live up to it. And so you build up a whole new set of barriers. So rather than bringing the barriers down, and rather than being able to establish that the fences have to be open, we increasingly lived in a world in which we had higher and higher frontiers. And they were frontiers that disturbed me in some very important ways. Because in the security arrangements that were introduced after 9/11, and nobody had any reservation that this was not a threat. But again, if I can quote President Obama on Tuesday, that we should never let the question of safety and security override our fundamental values and beliefs, because once we give up those beliefs, we become weakened to deal with the kind of fanaticism that we see around the world. And what he was talking about is the illegal arrests, the discrimination at the border. How many people in your own acquaintance, and I know there's several in mine, who've been hauled aside because of their background, their name, their ethnicity, their culture. They looked like they might be a risk simply because they didn't have a name that came over on the Mayflower. And we have a thing called the Canadian Charter, which protects against that and was basically disemboweled. It wasn't recognized. And I'm saying that weakened us, that undermined us in this kind of world of new risks. Boy, I wanted to make sure that we had all the tools at our disposal, and to me the most effective one was our ability to say that there are certain things that we trust as being crucial to who we are as Canadians. And that is treating people regardless of color, religion, culture, background, with the same respect. And there was no such thing as second-class citizens. And yet we were almost being compelled and enforced to go back on those beliefs, to give them up. I don't know how you feel, but for me, it was an enormous sense of relief listening to the inauguration speech to hear a president of the United States saying, folks, we're not going to do that anymore. We're going to close down Guantanamo. We're not going to illegally arrest people and hold them in detention without any legal recourse for years and years and years. The message that spreads to the rest of the world is as powerful as any military weapon that you could possibly imagine. That's what really helps to change and alter the views and to begin to win the friends that we so desperately need. Kofi Annan, the former Secretary General, in his parting speech, said that the transcendent central issue of the 21st century is how to overcome the threats and challenges that transcend borders. He called it problems without passports. That nobody can put a national label on it. And that we really have to rethink the notion of our citizenship and our responsibilities, and how do we define that? And I think that is where sort of the last 8 years was difficult, and in some cases tragic, for a lot of reasons, but most importantly because as the pressure began to build on these broad issues that sweep over us, we were substantially weakening and eroding and withdrawing our capacity to meet them and match them. And so when we talk to President Obama when he shows up in Ottawa, there's a lot of things we got to talk about crossing the borders and everything else. But fundamentally, we also have to talk about the issue of architecture. Look, when I was Foreign Affairs Minister, I saw myself as basically a plumber. Yeah? There was a bunch of leaks, and you were kind of asked to plug this leak and stop this, until I began to realize that if you have too many leaks, there's something wrong with your fundamental way you built the house. And you got to start over again. You got to rebuild it. You got to build a new framework. And that's where we are right now, today. That we've got to sort of take ourselves out of the little bit of the wreckage that we've been in and say, how do we rebuild out of it? Because we are now in a position where there's the U.S. president who's speaking that language, and it seems, at least at first blush, prepared to once again put the United States into a position of leadership. Let's not forget, because some people in this country get kind of raspy about Americans and what they do. I'm not one of those. Because I remember so well that after the Second World War, when the world was in chaos and all around us was rubble, that it was the United States, with our help, by the way, that put in place the United Nations, that put in place an international global trading regime, that put in place an international monetary regime. They created a new, and we were part of it. John Humphrey helped write the first Charter of Human Rights in the United Nations. Mike Pearson, who was then our foreign minister, was the one who sort of helped bring about the creation of the United Nations, and when it was in threat and challenge, was the author of the first major international peacekeeping force, a brand new innovation for a new age. We were out there on the edge. We were doing some things that Americans couldn't do, but we worked together with them on it. So I think it's it's time that we ask, what kind of role do we play now with Mr. Obama? What are the things that we can begin to do? And I think the signals are there. No big mystery. I'm not telling you something that comes out of a black box. He's signaled what he's going to do. We have to get together to deal with this financial crisis. And what it means is that we have to recreate the notion of a public domain. Now, that's kind of a fancy academic word, which I've only learned in the last few years since they let me back in the university. But what it means is, in the United States and in Canada and parts of Europe and other parts of the world, a lot of people have spent a lot of time over a lot of generations building the notion that we are a society governed by rules. And everybody's accountable, whether you're the richest or the poorest, whether you're a business person or an academic or a policeman, there are rules you have to obey. There is a domain that says, here's how you have to be held accountable. Here's your responsibilities as a citizen. You don't get a free ride just simply because you vote. It's not the me generation. There is an incumbency in being a citizen of what you are expected to do. And that's how we build a public domain that works. And we respect the right of churches of different kinds to follow their own faiths. We respect the idea that groups can advocate for more rights for women or for disabled. We respect the right of trade unions to organize and for business to be able to develop investments in markets. But behind it all is the fundamental notion that there are some rules we have to play by. And I think what we're hearing from the new president is we need to take that public domain, that notion of being rules, and translate it into a much larger stage, a global stage. And boy, that's not easy, but it's got to be done if we're going to be able to manage this kind of changing and somewhat chaotic landscape I described. And I believe deep down, that we as Canadians are in a community that can help create that new domain. I think we bring certain things. If not, doesn't make us better, it's who we are. That we have created over the life of this country, beginning with our First Nations people, in terms of the use of negotiation. You know, if you go into decision-making in the First Nations village, you don't sit across from each other like we do in Parliament, 2.5 sword lengths. You sit in a circle and you talk. Maybe you talk and talk, but you talk about it before you bring the weapons forward. I just finished reading an amazing book written by an American historian about Champlain, the discoverer of Canada. But here's what he said, that Champlain didn't come just because he kind of lost his way in his boats and ended up in the Gaspé and the St. Lawrence Seaway. He was part of a group of humanists in 15th century France who had gone through 60 years of religious wars where 2 million people were killed. Do you think we're good at genocide? They were pretty good in the 15th century. They know how to kill people pretty fast and furious as well. And they went through that, and out of that came a group of thinkers and people centered around Henry IV, who said, we've got to build a new society where we don't kill people because of what they believe in. And that basic humanism became the reason why Champlain came to the New World and called it La Nouvelle France, not because it was a new place to find beaver and elk. They really had a notion that this is a place in Canada that we could build an open society, and that the relationships with the First Nations when they arrived was not like the British or the Dutch or the Spanish, treating them as savages. They treated them with equal respect. And it is one of the most distinctive and important historical and cultural developments in the world that you can establish a society based upon differences of groups and people and language and culture and get along and do things together without ever losing that distinction. There's not many places in the world where that pertains. We are so blessed of having had that kind of history behind us, followed all the way through to our present day. And surely What a gift we can bring to the rest of the world by saying this notion of pluralism, this notion that we can create societies where differences can be respected, that we can find ways of solving a problem other than at the end of a gun. That is what I think the world cries out for, and where we can try to reinforce and enhance what I think is the basic instincts of President Obama to find a way of doing that. And he used to get laughed at during the campaign because he was a community organizer. You know, I mean, Mr. McCain and then the Republicans say, oh, God, a community organizer, what's that? Well, you know, I went to school down in the States in the 60s. I did my graduate work when community organizing was the founding bed of the civil rights movement, which was the place in which we began to establish the notion that rights are not just the right to speak and the right to assemble, it was the right to have identity and respect for who you were. And he comes out of that tradition. That's what this election, that's why people in the United States are celebrating, because they finally have come through a crossroads where they now understand it. But our society, we've been there. We've done it. We're not perfect. But just think if we were able to bring that deep understanding of our history and our capacity to resolve issues and solutions based upon mutual respect and bring it in as a partner with the power that the United States can wield, just think how we can begin to really transform and make changes around this world. I'm excited by that prospect. I think there's something that when President Obama shows up in Ottawa, of course, the Prime Minister and the government and the Cabinet and the Parliament are going to have to talk about energy and environment and climate. Those are important things. But I hope we find some time to say, look, how do we get this together? And of course, the place where that discussion, conversation will start is what do we do in our terms of our mutual involvement in Afghanistan? And if there's a place where we have to make a switch, and I'm sure that this, as any Canadian audience, is about evenly divided, whether we should be there or not. But here's what I think, and I base it on my own experience. That it's not a matter of how many more troops we put in. It's what we do when we get there. And are we using the troops to chase the Taliban up in the hills? Or are we using them to protect the kids so they can go to school? Are we providing human security for the people of Afghanistan so they don't feel threatened? That we're not using it to bomb, to defeat, to have a military victory, but we're there to provide security for the people of Afghanistan so they can rebuild their economy, get rid of a corrupt government, kids can go to school, women can have their rights. That's a very different strategy. So it's not a matter of arguing about the number of troops. It's about what kind of forces do we send? We may be much better off sending police to Afghanistan to deal with the deep down corruption of the place, to help them recreate a democratic government, to deal with the poppy fields, which are the largest source of opium and heroin in the world. There's lots of things that we can do without saying that we have to have boots on the ground. And that's the kind of conversation we should have with Mr. Obama, who says he wants to kind of resolve the issue. And that doesn't mean he's walking out and leaving the field to the Taliban. Nobody wants to do that. But let's be a little smarter about how we do it. And let's not simply buy what Mr. Bush's view was, that you can defeat them militarily, and that's where 98% of the resources go. I think it's time that we got into that conversation with the new president. And I'm going to leave you with this thought. Maybe a new one, or maybe you've heard it before, but one of the last things that I was involved in before I left Foreign Affairs is that we sort of try to think our way through what kind of international responsibility is there in a place where there's a genocide in Rwanda. I sat in cabinet, and I wasn't foreign affairs minister, I was a human resource minister, but I was around the cabinet when the notes would come in from General Dallaire from Rwanda, pleading, anguished about the fact that under the rules of the UN, he could not intervene to protect the people who were being murdered with machetes. And so I vowed when I became foreign minister that I was going to do my best to never let that happen again. that I needed to find as a Canadian working with others, are there some ways that we can make sure that what happened in Rwanda will not happen again? Well, we know it is happening again. Today in Darfur, there's 25,000 people a month starving to death or being killed with machetes or being mass raped. The same thing is happening in the eastern Congo. Same thing is happening in northern Uganda. Same thing is happening in southern Sudan. The list goes on. I'm not here to give you a litany. But what we try to say is, look, where there is this incredible threat of violation to individuals, it's up to the government of where that transgression is taking place to either protect people or to give up the responsibility and transfer it to the international community. And so we're saying that if a government can't protect or won't protect, or itself is the predator that actually is the one that murders those people, then we can't stand by and let it happen. We have to take a responsibility, which is a word, by the way, that we used 11 times in President Obama's inauguration speech. Responsibility to protect. That's a Canadian-made idea. It's one, by the way, that he endorses, that he himself uses. Here is a candidate, before he was ever elected, giving a statement in the New York Times about what his foreign policy was, and then halfway through the discourse he said, I really think this idea of responsibility to protect, an idea that we came up with as Canadians, is one that now has to be looked at and applied. So shouldn't we take a moment when President Obama here said, look, it was our idea. We think we know how we can help make it work. Can we work with you to make it work? Can we put our Canadian talents to work in perhaps what is the most sort of vile issue of innocent kids being killed, of people being murdered, of the gang rapes going on in the Congo? Because after all, as I try to say, if the issues transcend the borders, so does our sense of responsibility have to transcend those borders. We can't hide behind them anymore. And thank be to God, we now have a U.S. president who I think gets it, understands it. But we're the ones who developed the idea. We're the ones who put it in place. We're the ones who got it through the United Nations in 2005 and got it passed. So I think that while we certainly have to deal with all the bundle of issues across the border, we have to take time and look at that architecture, that structure, and the deep-set flaws. And of course, a good place to start is how we approach our responsibilities in Afghanistan. And I would hasten a judgment, and it's only my judgment, you don't have to accept it, that if we shifted our view to the protection of the people in Afghanistan, as opposed to a military victory over the Taliban, we might find a very different result, and that they wouldn't be winning the battle as they are now. And maybe that's one of the messages that we can hope to bring when President Obama visits our fair country. So that's the kind of conversation I think we should have. But before we have it, we have to have a conversation amongst ourselves. We have to, once again, express that those are the things we believe in. Those are the things that we think we can do, that we are prepared to make that effort, to accept those responsibilities, to reach out, to connect, to bring our values, not to impose them in some imperial way, but to share them, to show that it works for us. And if we can sort of get some kind of agreement, consensus, general approach around some of these ideas, when the president comes to Ottawa, just think of what a signal that sends to the rest of the world. That what we might do in the Middle East, what we might do to deal with the drug lords, what we might do to offset the terrorists. If they said, okay, now the Canadians and Americans are back in sync again. They're working together on these issues again. It gives us an opportunity to deal not just with the transactional issues, but to deal with those deep structural flaws in the global system. And that we can bring skill and motivation and experience in helping with the design, the creation, and the outreach to bring that new architecture into place. We could begin by asking President Obama, first thing, to rescind Mr. Bush's directive about the Arctic and saying, we don't agree with that's the way we should go. Our government has taken efforts to try to bring about some better way of dealing with the Arctic. Rescind this and let's get together and work out how in this vital, fragile, ecological area, which also has a potential of being an enormously potent spur to our growth and our economic development, running new corridors down the various parts of North America, opening up new trade lines. Let's work something out that brings everybody together on a common set of rules about what ships can do and how resources will be developed and how the environment is protected and how our northern peoples participate. Boy, think of what message and signal that sends to the world, that we've taken one of the most serious issues and we've kind of worked out a deal with this new president to say you can collaborate, you can cooperate, you can work together, and you can do it on the basis of mutual benefit, not unilateral self-interest. That's the difference. That's the basis, I think, of the kind of conversation. And it's not, by the way, if I can be allowed just a minute or two, it's not just a conversation between Prime Minister Harper and President Obama or their foreign minister and their Secretary of State. It's a conversation I think we all have to start having. Our universities must become sort of the source beds, as Ike Barber was talking about, of the innovation and ideas that we can bring together, bear on new public policy that makes this work. And the new technologies and the new ways of work and the new ways of managing our finances. Our business community can become sort of the repository of how do we work our way out of a crisis, but in a way that obeys certain rules, that looks at a public domain as a way in which responsible business activity takes place. Our civic communities, our NGOs, our people can say, how do we connect with our counterparts in the United States to get a common agenda on the environment, on the Arctic, on our water? That border shouldn't be there as a barrier. It should be there simply as a way in which we find new coalitions and new arrangements and new linkages. And we have in our hands something that, you know, the magic mystery of the new web-based communications. You don't have to sort of get in your car and drive to Spokane anymore. You can connect around the world in a nanosecond and talk and discuss and debate and analyze and bring people together. There's a group in Toronto called Taking It Global, a group of young men and women, all under the ages of 21, who a year ago started a group to say, how do we get a dialogue going amongst Canadians and Americans and Africans and Latin Americans about issues like nuclear proliferation. And they started out just using the simple tools that by turning on the laptop and kicking it out, they now have 750,000 connections every day. And they're sharing views about the way the world should go. They're now sort of translating that into what you call virtual reality. You know, you now live in a second world. And you start designing your own laws and your own rules and your own institutions. And some of them are pretty interesting, I got to tell you. I got plugged in, there was meetings at New York and UN last fall when I was there to talk about the International Criminal Court. And Lorenzo DeCampo, who's the prosecutor, and I were supposed to come and help all these young people kind of understand. Well, in 10 minutes, they forgot about us. They were out there on their new second reality, building a whole new forum of international law and rules, which for my money I would have translated immediately and brought them back out of second reality into our reality and make them work. What a potential we have now for conversation of all kinds, of all places, amongst all kinds of people in terms of building some common answers to these common issues that know no passports. I mean, I'm kind of envious of young men and women today because I'd love to have the capacity that they now have to provide the enormous reach and connection that wasn't there in my generation. What an extraordinary power and potential that now resides in these hands. And not just, you don't have to be 28 or 23. You can be 68 or 80 to also make those same kind of linkages and connections. It's really So fascinating, and we've only scratched the surface. We were talking over dinner tonight how Obama revolutionized politics. I'm from the old school. I used to knock on doors. That's why I'm a little shorter than I used to be, because I had to walk a lot of, my riding was downtown Winnipeg, a lot of high rises, a lot of pavement. Where's your doubt? But now, he has 2.5 million Americans. By the way, there's probably a lot of Canadians on his network as well. Raised $250 million. But that network still exists. There's 2.5 million people that will provide the most powerful lobby in the United States. Just think when President Obama says, I want a new health care bill, and the congressman from Ohio says, I don't want a new health, and all of a sudden those 2.5 million people are emailing the hell out of that congressman. Do you think he's going to start changing his mind? I can tell you, politicians know how to count. And the number of emails, you understand, those are votes. So we're at an age of enormous potential, but we got to get our head around it. We got to start conversing in ourselves and with others to make it work and to make it happen. So it's not just government to government. I think that there's a lot of room for a lot of coalition, network building, connection making. And I don't think it is simply a hobby. It's not something you do as a pastime, like you play a video game. It's something that I really think in the next 10 years, maybe even in the next 4 years, as the opening is there, as the window has come unstuck, as we now have a different kind of administration in the United States, that this is a chance to let our creative talents go to work. That's the kind of conversation that we should have with the U.S., but more important, it's a conversation we have to have amongst ourselves. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Axeworthy, for initiating this really important international dialogue and conversation with us in the Okanagan. I suspect that there's some appetite in the room to continue the conversation, which we'll do now. The First Nations tradition of the talking circle that Lloyd referred to often has another little piece, which is the talking stick. Yes. And only the person with the talking stick may talk. We've got a little different version of it here. We have a couple of microphones that we'll pass around, so if you have a question, please raise your hand. The microphone hopefully will be delivered to you, and if you have the microphone, you may speak.
I should tell you that I play by House of Commons rules, at least as I remember. You get one and then I kick back. That's all.
So when President Obama calls and says, I've got 254 detainees down in Guantanamo Bay, what are my options for dealing with them? What's your advice?
I think there's some very legitimate, some very good options. First, you can put them into the domestic court system, where all the rules of evidence and representation apply. Secondly, one of the things that we were able to do when we established the International Criminal Court through the Rome Statute was to actually set out a very clear set of procedures and processes by which you try war criminals under crimes against humanity, genocide, etc. When we passed the Rome Statute, that was in 1997, we actually incorporated those rules into our criminal code. So we actually have an international criminal code within our own legislation. And therefore, you have an option of either going into your own court system and applying those rules. You can set up a tribunal under international rules. It can be a tribunal. There's a variety of different kinds of international tribunals. Sometimes they're hybrid. You may have judges from your own national court system and then a couple of international judges. You can do it simply inviting sort of the international community to have a tribunal. I don't think that's a great mystery. I think all those jurisdictions and forums were there. President Bush and his vice president just did not want to use them. And again, if I might just kind of use your question as a way of saying, I think that this is where Canada can play a role. Is that, one of the detainees is Omar Kadar, who was arrested when he was 14, which means he was basically a child soldier, which is a different set of rules under the protocol on child soldiers. We could set a real precedent by saying yes. I know the government's looking at it, but here's my free advice, which is you get what you pay for. But we invite them to release Mr. Kadar into our jurisdiction, and we try him by the rules that we've established under the Rome Statute that we've put into our criminal code. And we make sure that he is given a fair trial, but it is a trial based upon clearly transparent, accountable rules. That is what we need to do. So.
Knowing, that, as you do, that in the 1970s, the National Security Administration of the United States identified that the lack of water resources in the American Southwest was the greatest long-term threat to its economy of the whole country. And knowing, as you do, that President Roosevelt assisted to spur the U.S. economy out of the Depression through the Tennessee Water
Valley Authority.
and Valley Authority and the Hoover Dam project, what do you think Canadians are going to say to Mr. Obama when he says, "We want your water"?
I guess you say it's not your water, it's ours. Actually, it's an important question, and if you don't mind, I'd like to kind of come at an answer from a couple of different angles. I think the first thing is that you're absolutely right that the use of fresh water around the world, and even in North America, probably represents one of the greatest challenges, risks, threats to humankind, simply because in so many places it's disappearing, other places it's misused. We've had an enormous luxury here in Canada because we've always thought that fresh water was just, well, in your case, you can fall off the cliff into the lake, and there it is. What we're discovering, however, is that increasingly there is a scarcity, and that we abuse the water we have simply by the way in which it's used and what we allow to go into it. I don't think that it's possible to come up with any answer unilaterally or within our own borders. I do think we have to talk to the Americans. Let me give you one example, as you probably know. You have an aquifer on the east side of the Rockies that runs all the way from Canada all the way south into Mexico. That aquifer is now, I think the last figure was about 60% depleted. It's going down at a percentage of about 2.5% a year. When that dries up, all that whole area, very active, from Calgary on down through Denver into Mexico, dries up. We know that the melt coming off the glaciers in our mountains is substantially reduced from where it was 2 years ago. So I think that the question is, that's got to be on the agenda as one of the most important shared concerns, and not to be governed by simply a demand from a U.S. Congress, a U.S. President saying, give it to me. There is a debate in NAFTA. I think when I was in the opposition, and I was the trade critic during the debate, we raised serious issues about whether the annex in NAFTA allowed the transfer of water. We were assured by the government at the time, Mr. Mulroney's government, that that did not apply to bulk water. It only applied to bottled water. I think there's a lot of ambiguity in that one. But I really do think this is a political discussion. And if I can, again, share an anecdote with you, back about '99, actually it was in the summer of 2000, just before I resigned, we had, up to that point, developed, I thought, an important procedure between Mexico, Canada, and the U.S. is about every 3 months or so, Madeleine Albright, who was then Secretary of State, and Rosario Green, who was the Mexican Secretary of State, and myself would get together, usually in New York at a meeting at the UN, or we would meet somewhere in the United States or somewhere here. We just thought that it would be important to have reasonably high level of political representatives of the three countries start talking about these issues, to use my word, conversation. So here's what happened. I was up fishing on Black Lake, which is up in northern Saskatchewan. 70 miles long, probably about 3 fishing boats on it, pristine fresh water. We flew out on an otter coming off, my son and I, and we looked down there was, a few boats. And then I caught a plane in Winnipeg and flew to Santa Fe for the meeting of these, what we used to call the Three Amigos. And we kind of got there, and it was, boy, you could just feel the dehydration. So on the driver on the way in, I said, it's been pretty dry here. He says, yeah, it hasn't rained for 4 months. In fact, if you spit in the sidewalk, you get a medal for, contribution to the environment. So it kind of made me think, and we got to the place where we're meeting. We were starting to have lunch, and one of the waiters poured a glass of fresh water. Now I had my agenda in front of me. There was no mention of water anywhere on that agenda. So I said to my 2 companions, I said, look, why don't we kind of ad hoc for a moment? Why don't we talk about fresh water? Well, I could see the senior official from Foreign Affairs Department having a cardiac arrest, saying, oh God, he's talking about water. We haven't briefed him. He doesn't know what That's the first time, the very first time that senior officials of the 3 levels of government sat down to talk seriously about the issue of fresh water in North America. And frankly, there hasn't been a lot of follow-up since then. There's lots of discussion going on at bureaucratic levels and so on. But I think it's going to take that kind of a forum where we bring together senior people and say, how do we work this out? Because here, you've got the Columbia River system that comes in here, it goes into Washington, it comes out. We've got the Red River system in Manitoba, you've got the St. Croix system, and there's about 18 different watersheds that we share with the Americans. We've never been able to get an agreement on how to manage those watersheds. And the International Joint Commission, which should be doing the job, was shelved 3 years ago because President Bush refused to appoint Americans on the commission. So we had this thing that's been around for close to 90 years to manage water problems, and that administration said, we don't care. So I think one of the first things we've got to do is we've got to engage them seriously on a freshwater discussion. Forget the prescriptions and NAFTA and stuff. I mean, that's 10 years ago. Forget it. Let's come up with a kind of discussion that said we're all in the same boat. We all basically share the same geography, the same ecology. And we're not giving you our water because you're demanding it, but we're going to find ways in which we conserve our water, treat our water, manage our water, so that we are all able to begin providing some sense of future. And again, if we do that, what does it say to the Israelis and the Palestinians, to the Ethiopians and the Eritreans, to the Pakistanis and the Indians, who are all sharing watersheds in which there's no management or governance? If we can come up with a North American plan, strategy, arrangement on fresh water, then again, it's an incredibly powerful model to demonstrate to the rest of the world that you can work out these solutions in a negotiated way based upon mutual respect, and that nobody wields the big stick. It's based on the fact that you're working on mutual benefit. That's where I think we have to, again, show some creative diplomacy as Canadians.
As a gent who interviewed you back in Winnipeg, for the Winnipeg Free Press, when you were director of the Institute of Urban Studies,
God, you got
the
quite a
very
memory.
institution of which you're now president and
Yes.
vice chancellor. And before that, years before that, in Ohio, interviewed Martin Luther King.
Mm-hmm.
And my preface to that question is, do you, with Obama's presidency now, foresee a full flowering of the spirit of the '60s, with the flowering the flower children and all that, and the issues and the ideals, a rebirth of the ideals of the '60s? I have a second question too, but I'll get to that, and that'll be shorter.
I don't know if it's a flowering, but I'm about 60 pounds heavier than I most of the time. I think that the 60s were history. of which we were able to both learn a lot, as you recounted it from that interview. I was involved in civil rights actions when I was a graduate student in the States and marched in the Birmingham Selma marches and things of that kind. I look back, I mean, I was watching the replays of those during the inauguration and, you know, felt, I mean, I wasn't in the front of the parade, I was just one of those people slogging along, but I felt kind of good that all so many years that something had happened, you know, that you now had a black man as a president, and that there was some precedent to it for those actions that were taken. But I don't think, and I think also that the 60s were also the birth of civil rights, which really began to do something very important to our politics, which said that decisions are not just made by elites. Decisions are made by the full participation of ordinary people. To me, that was the thing that I fought for as a student sort of in the United States, and still do. Frankly, I hope I can recreate that today, because I was talking to some of our friends at the university. At the University of Winnipeg now, that's what we're engaged in. We're doing a lot of community-based organizing and developing with Aboriginal young men and women and children in the inner city of Winnipeg, because we feel that they're not getting a fair deal when it gets to coming to school and university. And the only way to get them is not to simply say, you're welcome to come. You got to go in the street, you got to work in the schools, you got to help organize, you have to provide, provide financial assistance. So that spirit still is retained. What has happened, I think, since then is that those so-called cultural battles that we went into are coming to an end in some part. And that we're now in a position where we have to think more about what unites us and what divides us. I mean, it was a very divisive time in the 60s. It really pitted people against people. And I think that, and I am not the author, I really am always just reflecting, I think, what President Obama has said. We owe a lot to those who went before. We have gained a great deal from the battles that were fought. But those were battles of the past. We now have to find how do we unite for the future. And I think if he can take that philosophy and apply it not just to his own country, but to the rest of us as well, then I think some of those visions and dreams that we had as 60s kids finally might come true.
That's the second question.
Sure.
Is the Globe and Mail had a comparison, a graphic sketch comparison of the words used in Kennedy's speech of '61, and also Bush's speech, and Obama's, and with the words that enlarged as to how many times he said it, and and it seemed that Obama, to me, was really a global citizen.
Right.
And secondly, I ask you too, is the second question is, Ignatieff has gone up in the polls, according to the Globe, again, one of the national polling organizations. Would you, I mean, and he likes the, he identifies with the Obama presidency. Is there any possibility that you would return to politics again in an Ignatieff cabinet?
No. Because I don't think I could ever run again if my wife had divorce proceedings against me at the same time. No, can I just be very, very honest? I had a good run at it. I had 27 years, and I came away with an incredible sort of sense of satisfaction having been a public servant for that long and having been able to get the trust of people in my constituencies to support me. But I really think it's time for another generation. I mean, I really do think that I can help in a ways by talking, being in the university, I do a course with, on Canadian foreign policy. I try to talk to the kids about what I know, but it really is time for a change in generations with a different view and bring a different kind of application to it. That's my basic view, and I just think that there is such a pool of talent that I see in young men and women across this country, that they are going to emerge as real leaders. If I have one regret, it's that our political parties, and I speak of all our political parties, are not providing the venue, the forum in which that leadership feels that they're welcome or enhanced. That's one of the real weaknesses in our democracy right now, is our political parties have become election machines, not the forum for conversation.
Actually, this is on the same topic, basically. My question is, do you think that Stephen Harper or Michael Ignatieff have anything even close to an inkling of the vision that Obama has? And does Stephen Harper have the character to have a dialogue, like you were talking? And one follow, and a second part to the question is, can you drop some names of those young people?
I think this is what you call being put on the spot. Yes, I'm not going to duck, but I think the answer to your first question is that I'm sure that there isn't a Canadian politician at any level that doesn't understand very clearly what President Obama is talking about. He's made it very clear that they understand that that's going to put some real challenges for us to be able to respond. That's why we're meeting here tonight, to talk about some of the responses that we can make. And I do believe, just in my own reading of history and 30 years I spent in government, that I think that Canadian leaders of whatever political background understand that they must find the ways of working with a U.S. president, whatever political backgrounds they may have. And what I do feel, I mean, we haven't seen it yet, that's going to evolve, but clearly I think the fact that President Bush has left the scene means he takes a lot of things with him that I think do believe have been real restraints and real pressures on Canadian political leadership. Because we are susceptible. You know the history. And one reason why we're in Afghanistan is because Mr. Martin, when he was Prime Minister, felt pressure because the government of that day didn't agree to sign the missile defense agreement and asked his officials in Washington to come up with something that would show that we are on side with the Bush agenda. And they said, well, let's go to Afghanistan. I mean, we didn't. And I'm not being facetious. It wasn't much more sophisticated than that. And now we found ourselves in a very interesting pickle, as they say. So I think that leadership here will respond to it. And if they don't, then I think they'll hear from Canadians, because one thing we also know is that the impact that Obama is having right around the world, I think, is going to change our politics anyway. It will really set a new set of standards about what we expect from our political leaders. Just as in the past, we've set some standards for them, and that's where the reciprocity lies. So that's about as far as I'm going to go. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Axeworthy, for that very stimulating conversation and for reminding us about our responsibilities as global citizens. Thank you very much for coming.